Christmas Eve, 1945. A mysterious fire rips through the Sodder Residence in Fayetteville, West Virginia. At the time, George, his wife Jennie, and 4 of the 9 children would escape the blaze. The other 5 children wouldn't make it out of the house in time before the fire became fully involved of the residence and would die in the fire. Or would they? Welcome to the Campfire. Grab your s'mores on the way to the logs and the chairs, and happy holidays to everyone for whatever holiday that you celebrate during this time of year. I am your host, Kevin. This is the Campfire Crime Chronicles, a true crime podcast. Thanks for joining me tonight around the campfire on this cold and dreary night of Christmas Eve. This is the case of the Sodder family Christmas. George Sodder, born in 1895 in Tula, Sardinia, Italy. He immigrated to the U.S. at the age of 13 years old with his older brother, who would end up returning to Italy as soon as they both cleared through customs in Ellis Island. George began working for the railroad in Pennsylvania, carrying water and supplies for the laborers. Within a few years, he would take on a more permanent and promising work as a truck driver in Smithers, West Virginia. Eventually starting his own trucking company, initially hauling fill dirt to construction sites, then eventually moving to hauling coal for the coal mines in the area. Jennie Capriani also immigrated to the U.S. when she was only 3 years old. Her parents owned a local store called the Music Box in Smithers, West Virginia. George Sodder would visit the store where he would meet Jennie. The two would hit it off pretty quickly and eventually got married, where they would purchase a 2-story timber-framed house 2 miles outside of Fayetteville, West Virginia. George Sodder's business was very successful, and the Sodders would become one of the most respected middle-class families around. At the same time, George would sometimes alienate people with his strong views and opinions about certain topics and wouldn't be shy about expressing those opinions. The Sodders would have 10 children between 1923 and 1943. By 1943, their second oldest son, who was 21 years old, had left home to serve in the military during World War II. In 1945, a life insurance salesman visited George and, after being rebuffed, had given George a warning that his house would go up in smoke and flames, and following with telling George that his children would also be destroyed. This warning was because of all the dirty remarks that George has ever made about the Italian dictator, Mussolini. George would receive another visitor seeking work and would warn George that the pair of fuse boxes would cause a fire. George, confused by this because he had had the house rewired for an electric stove that they had installed, and the local electric company told George that it was perfectly safe. In the weeks leading up to Christmas that year, the oldest Sodder son would notice a strange car that would be parked along the main highway through town, where the occupants of the vehicle would be watching the younger Sodder children while they were returning from school. On Christmas Eve, the oldest daughter, Marion, who was 19, would buy gifts for her younger sisters as she had worked at the dime store in Fayetteville. Surprising the sisters when she arrived home with new toys, and being excited about their gifts, asked their mother if they could stay up past their bedtime at 10 p.m., which Jennie would tell the girls that they could stay up as long as the oldest brothers were still up. Eventually, everyone had either went to bed or had fallen asleep. Then around 12:30 a.m., Jennie was awoken by a phone ringing and would go downstairs to answer it. When Jennie answered the phone, the caller was from a woman's voice that Jennie didn't recognize, and asked for a name that she wasn't familiar with. Then there would be laughter over the phone with clinking glasses in the background. Jennie would tell the caller that they had the wrong number and would return to bed later, recalling the weird laughter. While returning to bed, she had noticed that the lights were still on and the curtains were still open, as well as the door being unlocked, which was unlike her children to do and wasn't like them to forget about. Marion had fallen asleep on the couch in the living room, and noticing the other children weren't in the living room, Jennie had assumed the other children had gone up into the attic where their bedroom was to sleep. Jennie would close the curtains and turn the lights off and lock the door and return to bed. At around 1 a.m., Jennie would be woken up again by the sound of an object hitting the roof with a loud bang and then the sound of something rolling. After hearing nothing further, she would go back to sleep. Approximately about a half hour later would be woken again to the smell of smoke. When she had gotten up to investigate, she found that George's office by the phone and the fuse box was on fire and it would be spreading. Jennie would wake George up and then woke up his older sons. Both parents and the 4 other children would escape the house: Marion, Sylvia, John, and George Jr. They would frantically yell for the other children that were upstairs, but would never hear a response from them. Before John Sodder exited the house, he would go upstairs to the other children's bedrooms and shake them to try to wake them up to escape the house, but was unsuccessful. When Jennie attempted to call for help, she was unsuccessful because the phone lines were dead. Efforts to find aid and rescue the children from the burning house was unexpectedly complicated. After Jennie was unsuccessful from calling for help, Marion would run to the neighbor's house to call for help, but was unsuccessful because their phone was also broken. A driver on a nearby road saw the flames and called from a nearby tavern. They too were unsuccessful because the phone was also broken and they were unable to reach the operator. The passing motorist was eventually successful in reaching the fire department from another phone in the center of town. While attempts of help were being reached back at the Sodder house, George, who was barefoot, was looking for a way to get into the attic window, as the first floor was already consumed by flames. George and his sons attempted to use the ladder, but it wasn't in the usual resting spot, nor was it able to be found anywhere nearby. Then George attempted to start both of his trucks that he used for his business to climb the window, but despite working perfectly the day before, they wouldn't start. With no other options seen, he would attempt to climb the exterior wall of the house and broke the attic window, cutting his arm in the process. There was a water barrel that could have been used to help suppress the fire. However, it was frozen, being the middle of December. According to witnesses at the fire, they would state that they had seen a man leaving the scene with a block and tackle. Frustrated, the 6 Sodders that did escape the blaze had no choice but to watch their house burn down and collapse over the span of 45 minutes. They had assumed the other 5 children perished in the blaze. The fire department, which was strictly volunteer, was low on manpower due to the war and was also relying on each firefighter to call each other. After arriving on scene later that morning, the chief at the time, F.J. Morris, said the next day that the slow response was further hampered by the fact that he was unable to drive the fire truck and had to wait until someone who could drive was available. By 10 a.m., after the fire was out and sifting through the ashes of what was left of their home, Chief Morris told the Sodder family that no bodies were found of the missing children and that they were presumed to have never made it out of the fire. It was reported that the scene was searched for about 2 hours for the children's remains, which may not have been a sufficient amount of time for a house that was totally collapsed and burned to the ground by the time the fire department showed up. Morris told George Sodder to not disturb the scene until the fire marshal's office came in to conduct their own investigation. However, the fire marshal's office would not conduct a further investigation after their initial visit to the scene and would conclude that the children had died in the fire and that the cause of the fire was undetermined. With such a brief examination of the scene, the police chief at the time made a statement that the fire was accidentally caused by faulty wiring, despite the fact that George had the wiring checked just a few weeks prior. Also, it was reported that the Christmas lights had remained on during the initial part of the fire as the house was burning. Another detail coming from family and those at the scene, the observation that there wasn't any odor of burning flesh during the fire was noted. When flesh burns in a fire, it has a very distinct smell to it that you never forget, and you will know when you smell it. It was found that the phone lines were cut to the house. They were cut at a height of 14 feet from the ground and 2 feet from the telephone pole. And you remember that ladder that George and his sons were looking for during the fire? Well, it was found 75 feet away from its usual spot over an embankment. It was presumed that the ladder was used to cut the phone lines. Theories of why the investigation and search for the remains were minimal at best was the fact that it was Christmas Day and that the damage was done and the children had already died. That, though, is just speculation. There's no reports or evidence of that theory. So what investigation that was done, though, found that the caller who made the wrong number was found by police and questioned. As for the guy who stole the block and tackle, he admitted to the theft, as well as admitting to cutting the phone lines, thinking that they were power lines, which explains why the Sodders couldn't call out when they tried prior to leaving the house, and also the power remained on. There was doubt by the investigators, though, that the thief cut the phone lines because of the height that they were cut at. Although admitting to cutting the phone lines and the theft, he denied having anything to do with the fire. After the fire, sometime between 1946 and 1947, the Sodders hired private detective C.C. Tinsley, who discovered that the salesman was a member of the coroner's jury, who ruled the fire to be an accident. Tinsley also learned of rumors that, despite his report to the Sodders that no remains had been found in the ashes, Morris had indeed found a heart which he later packed into a metal box and secretly buried. Reverend James Frame also heard a rumor that Morris had buried a heart in the debris, and then when confronted by Frame and Morris, he had confirmed the rumor to be true. The Sodder family was never convinced that their children perished in the fire, as their remains were never found. When confronted, Fire Chief Morris admitted that he found evidence of the Sodder children dying in the fire, stating that he found a heart which he then buried. It's hard to believe that he would find a heart and not any bones. The box was excavated, then brought to Harold Gay, owner of Gay Funeral Home in Montgomery, which then, in a signed affidavit, Harold determined to what he said was to be a fresh beef liver that was exposed to no fire. Morris would then admit that he made the story up so that the Sodders would stop looking for their children. Tinsley would ask Harold to preserve the beef liver until he could make arrangements to have it be verified that it was truly a beef liver. Harold would put embalming fluid into the box with the liver to preserve it and then sat it outside on the back porch until Tinsley was ready for it. 10 days later, Tinsley would call to let him know that he'd be coming the next day to pick it up. Harold then moved the box to the back steps. The next day, when Tinsley arrived for the box, it was gone. Speculations believe that the sanitation department may have picked it up, thinking that it was part of the trash pickup. In 1947, two odd occurrences would occur that would rekindle their doubts that the children had died in the fire. A post by Beckley Post-Herald from John Sodder that day after the fire, he had stated that he believed the fire was deliberately set, which was also a theory amongst the rest of the Sodder family. Early in 1947, Look magazine published an essay which had a picture depicting the kids in New York of a public school. That one of those kids had a striking close resemblance of one of their own children. So George and Jennie would travel to New York to look into it, but were denied access to the school and access to any of the children. Still doubting that their children died in the fire from lack of evidence and no remains being found, on the morning of the fire, Jennie began researching and experimenting burning bones. She read a news article about a similar fire of a 3-story home that 7 people had died in, and all 7 skeletons were found. She also spoke with a crematorium where they told her that they burned bodies for 2 hours at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and sometimes bone fragments still remain. The Sodders would attempt to enlist the help of the FBI to investigate the fire and their children. However, they would receive a response from FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover stating, quote, "Although I would be of service, the matter related appears to be of local character and does not come within the investigative jurisdiction of this Bureau." End quote. It turns out that both the police and the fire departments refused to let the FBI assist with the investigation. Had the local police requested FBI assistance, they would have sent agents to help with the investigation. In August of 1949, nearly 4 years after the fire, the Sodders brought in pathologist Oscar B. Hunter to excavate and examine the scene. Though they found a few objects, a damaged coin, burned dictionary, and shards of vertebrae, which were sent to Marshall Newman, who was a specialist at the Smithsonian Institution. He determined that the age range of the vertebrae found were to be anywhere from 16 and 17 to 22 years old, and were also not exposed to any fire. Newman would add that the bones showed no sign of exposure to flame, and further agreed that it was very strange, quote, end quote, that those bones were the only ones found, since a wood fire such a short duration should have left full skeletons of all the children behind. The report concluded that the vertebrae had instead most likely come from the dirt that George had used to bulldoze the site. So within a week of the fire, and that the fire marshals and the police department weren't going to do a further investigation, George had the basement, which were the only remains of the house, filled in with dirt. This, of course, contaminated the scene. Also, reports were that the fire burned for only a short period of time. However, it actually burned all night into the next morning, and when the fire department arrived on scene, they had to suppress the fire with water before they could start searching the scene. It's speculated that when George had the basement filled in with dirt, that the bone fragments came from the dirt that was used to fill in the basement. In 1952, the Sodders put up a billboard sign on the property where their house once sat, and then another on Route 60 near Ansted. Both signs read, quote, "What was their fate? Kidnapped, murdered, or are they still alive?" On this sign had details of the fire and had the question why there had been no odor of burning flesh. The sign also questioned the motive of law enforcement involved and what they gained by the Sodders suffering, and most importantly, why there were no remains. The sign would quickly become a landmark, and the reward offered first 5,000 and then quickly doubled to 10,000. This would cause Jennie and George to receive frequent calls about tips. With all the tips that came in, George would personally investigate all the leads and tips. Anywhere from St. Louis, where Martha was reported being held in a convent, to Texas, where a bar patron made claims of overhearing two people talking and incriminating themselves about a fire that happened in West Virginia on Christmas Eve, quote unquote, some time ago. The most credible tip that Louise might still be alive would be when Jennie received a letter with no return address with a picture of a man about 30, which, if he had survived, would be in his 30s at that time. And on the back of the picture, it would read, "Louise Sodder, I love brother Frankie, little boys." The family hired another private detective to go to Central City and to look into this picture that they received of Louise, but he never reported back to the Sodders, and they were never able to locate him afterwards. The picture, nonetheless, gave them hope. They added it to the billboard, leaving Central City out of it and other published information out of fear that Louise might come into harm. The Sodders would put an enlargement of the photo over their fireplace. When leads and tips started to wind down and come to a stop, George would feel like he would just be hitting a rock wall. The Sodders were just looking for answers one way or another. If they had died, they just wanted that evidence. If they were alive, they wanted to know what happened to them. The surviving Sodder children, joined by their own children, continued to publicize the case and investigate leads. They, along with older Fayetteville residents, have theorized that the Sicilian Mafia and that they were trying to extort money from George, and that the children may have been taken by someone who knew about the planned arson and thought that maybe they would be safer if they had left the house. Theories and speculation thought that perhaps they were taken back to Italy. If the children had survived all those years and were aware that their parents and siblings survived too, the family believes they may have avoided contact in order to keep them from harm's way. Since the dawn of the 21st century, the family has incorporated the use of technology and the internet using forums, blogs, such as websleuths.com for additional media coverage, with the increase in the latter to expand resources for the search of what could have possibly happened to the children, led fresh eyes and people who have examined the scene, and there are several who believe that the children did in fact die in 1945. George Bragg, who's a local author that wrote about the case in 2012 and published the book West Virginia's Unsolved Murders, believes that John was telling the truth in his original account to state troopers when he said that he tried to physically awake his siblings before leaving the house. He allows that the conclusion may still not be correct, quoting, "Logic tells you that they probably did burn up in the fire, but you can't always go by logic," end quote. Stacey Horn, who did a segment on the case for National Public Radio around its 60th anniversary in 2005, also believes the children's death in the fire is the most plausible solution. In a post on Stacy's blog with material she had to cut from her story for time, she noted that the fire continued to smolder all night after the house collapsed and that 2 hours was not enough time to search the ash thoroughly. If you remember in the beginning of the story, I also mentioned that 2 hours was not enough time to perhaps do a thorough search of the entire scene. Stacy goes on to say in her blog post that even if 2 hours was enough time, the firefighters on scene may not have known what exactly they were looking for. However, she says, quote, there is enough genuine weirdness about this whole thing that if someday it is learned that the children did not die in the fire, I won't be shocked. End quote. Then, in 2022, the History Channel aired an episode of its series History's Greatest Mysteries that detailed the events of the case. George died in 1969, and Jennie would die 20 years later after George. Okay, guys, so now that we have gone through the case, and everything I've read has people conflicted. Some are either they had died in 1945 on Christmas Eve in the house fire. And then I have others who claim, think, believe that they have survived all these years and they have never contacted their family or attempted to contact their family. And they speculate because they believe the Sicilian Mafia or someone would be after them. So I'm going to go over the evidence that I have found that I didn't put into the timeline and I want to save for the end of the episode. So, during the fire, evidence had emerged from one source stating that the fire was not caused by an electrical fault and that it was instead set deliberately as the Sodder family had originally thought. A bus driver was passing through Fayetteville late Christmas Eve, and he made claims that he saw some people throwing balls of fire at the house. Then, a few months after the fire, when the snow had melted and spring was emerging, Sylvia found a small, hard, dark green, rubber ball-like object in the bush nearby. George, recalling his wife's account of a loud thump on the roof before the fire, said it looked like a pineapple bomb. The family had claimed, despite the fire marshal's report and conclusion, that the fire started on the roof. However, with it burning to the ground and collapsing in on itself, it's almost impossible to prove where the fire started. Then there was a few other sources that stated that witnesses had claimed to have seen the missing Sodder children themselves. One woman who had been watching the fire from the road said that she had seen some of them peering out of a passing car while the house was burning. Then another woman at a rest stop between Fayetteville and Charleston stated that she served breakfast to the children the next morning, and also noting that there was a car from Florida in the parking lot. Now, the car that was from Florida could coincidentally just be there for breakfast, going to or from seeing family, and she may have actually physically seen the children there also, and the two may not be related at all. There's no way to tell. Well, everyone, I took a different approach with this case because there's no solid proof that a crime and murder did occur, and there's no solid proof that it was merely an accident and the kids did just happen to die in the fire. So I wanted to take a different approach with this case, and I wanted to leave you with this, something to think about as you're finishing your s'mores or packing up from the campfire on your drive home to wherever you're going. That, what do you think? And let me know on social media your thoughts, your opinions. I brought to you all the evidence that I could and all the facts and details that I could that I have found. There is a lot of information out there, and depending on what you're looking at, even if you looked into those leads and tips that George had received and the family had received, you could go into so many different directions with those theories. So let me know what you guys think. If you think they died in the fire in 1945, or if you think they survived and what happened to them. I'm curious to know. Personally, I think they died in the fire in 1945. With the resources they had in 1945 and the investigation that they did or didn't do and the search that they went through the scene, 2 hours, depending on how much manpower they had, 2 hours might be enough time to go through a scene. But that depends solely on how much manpower they actually had. And if they had a minimal crew due to the war and how they were alerted to the calls, and if some members didn't get that call, they didn't respond. So if they were working with a minimal crew, then 2 hours obviously would not be enough time and they would need to take more time. If they had an abundance of crew members, then 2 hours might be enough time. I don't know. I wasn't there in 1945. So there's a lot of factors that could play into the result of finding or not finding the children that perished that night, if they perished that night. But from what I have read and researched and my own experience in the fire service, I believe that they died in 1945. Also, I don't think they would wait this long if they did survive to not make contact with their family. I think they, after some time, if they were that worried about someone finding out and causing harm to them or their family members, that they would have reached out eventually after some time has passed. And I'm not saying 1 or 2 years, but probably at least 10 years gone by, they would have started to try to reach out and make contact. All right, guys. So that concludes this tale at the campfire. All resources used to gather information for the case include, but not limited to, news articles, reports, documentaries, and other sources. I know there is a lot to cover in this case, and there is a lot of information I didn't cover in this case that is out there and available. I appreciate everyone who has gathered by the campfire with me for this case on this Christmas Eve. Also, if you're not a Patreon member, go to Patreon and sign up for the bonfire so you can listen to the bonus episode, which is another Christmas case that took place in California. A little bit different than West Virginia, New Jersey, or Florida. But while I was researching cases that happened over Christmas, I came across that one and it caught my eye. Also, talking about the bonfire and Patreon, if you'd like to listen to ad-free shows as well as bonus episodes and get a shout out on the podcast during the most recent episodes, then sign up and join me over at the bonfire. You can find the bonfire over on Patreon, where there are different tiers you can choose from. As we progress with growth, more tiers will be added. I appreciate all the support from all the listeners and supporters. Also, if you wish to contribute to the show, you can help support the show through the Campfire's PayPal, which a link will be provided in the show notes. So join me next time in a few weeks as we gather around the campfire for the next grisly tale. I'll be taking a few weeks off as I won't be releasing an episode on January 1st because I will be traveling for the holidays and I will not be near the studio to record. So, remember to sleep with one eye open, and this is the Campfire Crime Chronicles, a true crime podcast.